Okay, so this video is going to be on chapter 4 of academic ableism, and because the chapter is so long, I'm splitting it into two parts. So this is going to cover the first half of chapter 4, and then the next video will cover the second half. And I have our little octopus friend and this little fox. They're so cute, I love them. Okay, so we'll just get right into it. The previous two spatial metaphors that Dolmage used were the steep steps and the retrofit, and in this chapter he moves on to the third one, which is universal design. And so he says that in explaining universal design, he wants to emphasize the importance of the priority and activity of universal design as a process and a mode of becoming. He spends this entire chapter going into universal design in a lot of detail, but this first subsection just provides a little bit of an introduction to it, and then he elaborates on many of the points later. So he explains that universal design has gone through what linguists call a nominalization, meaning that it's been changed from a verb into a noun, so a solid, clearly defined thing rather than a process. However, in this chapter, he tries to reanimate universal design as a verb, as a process. He states that the universal design movement was first an architectural movement that worked against the exclusion of people with disabilities and argued that instead of temporarily accommodating difference, physical structures should be designed with a wide range of citizens in mind, planning for the active involvement of all. And so the principles for universal design were developed by a team of researchers at North Carolina State University and are now widely accepted as definitive of the concept. So these principles are equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, and size and space for approach and use. And so I think the only one I really have to explain is perceptible information, which just refers to the fact that the design should communicate the necessary information effectively to the user, regardless of the conditions of the user's sensory abilities. But I think all the other sort of titles pretty much explain the principle itself. He acknowledges that when these principles are put into list format and are applied solely to the physical environment, universal design looks a lot like a set of specifications, which is how it's often interpreted, but when universal design is registered as action, it's a way to move, it's almost a world view in a way. So he explains that universal design is a means of pushing towards a view of space as a process that is open to multiple possibilities, and acknowledging that our design practices have long been biased. And so it's a way of imagining a society in which the accessibility we create for one person can also lead us to broaden and expand accessibility for all. Even though universal design originated as a way to think about physical access, Dolmage explains that we have to recognize that physical access isn't enough, meaning that it's not where accessibility should stop. He references Leonard Davis, who states that if universals exist, what is universal in life is the experience of the limitations of the body, and so difference is what we all have in common. Dolmage clarifies that Davis isn't saying that we're all disabled, but showing that we're all non-standard, disabled by oppression and injustice, and so in response to this, we can either disavow our differences and project it upon others, as the institution has so often done, or we can join in an ethic of liberation. Finally, Dolmage explains that the elements of universal design are means of reorienting not just priorities, but also conversations and theories. He says that he personally likes universal design mainly because of the verb design. The active dimension suggests that it's a way to plan, to foresee, to imagine the future. And also the universal of universal design suggests that disability is something that's always a part of our worldview, so when it's successful, it's hopeful and realistic, allowing teachers to structure space and pedagogy in the broadest possible manner. He states, universal design is not about buildings, it's about building. Building community, building better pedagogy, building opportunities for agency. It's a way to move. So that first bit was just a primer on universal design, and these next few subsections is where he really starts getting into it. And so this next subsection is called Deep, Transformative, Tolerant, Redundant. And he begins by explaining that in the historical transition between universal design as an architectural concept to universal design as a concept for design of classrooms or social spaces, there was also a transition away from simply seeing disability as being about wheelchair access. And so he references Star Ford, who developed the concept of deep accessibility to address universal design's original focus on physical space and expand the concepts to sensory and cognitive levels of ability. So Ford proposed 5 levels. First, movement, so getting there, how we get to an event or class. Then there's sense, which is being there, how we access the material, the conversation. Third, there's architecture, so orienting, how the space and layout structure are belonging and understanding. Fourth, communication, so how we join the conversation, engage, understand, and are understood, what Zahari Richter calls communicative access. And then fifth, there's agency, just autonomy, how we can come to have a shaping role in the event or class, as well as the right to define our own identity and involvement. Dolmage argues that for universal design to work, we need to have all 5 levels of access because they're all interdependent, linking to the idea of transformative access. And so transformative access sees space, social space, and learning space as being in process and sees all involved in designing that space. And so he quotes Elizabeth Brewer, Melanie Yurgo, and Cynthia Self, who state, "There's a profound difference between consumptive access and transformative access. The former allows people to enter a space or access a text. The latter questions and rethinks the very construct of allowing." So he explains that if we were to look at some of the foundational principles of universal design and apply them beyond the physical sphere, we could begin to understand how deep accessibility and transformative access would work in a classroom. So he elaborates on the universal design principle of tolerance for error, saying that something like the autocorrect function could be seen as an example of this, and a more physical example would be a door which swings in both directions, has a lever handle that can be moved upward, downward, pushed or pulled to open the door, and also has an access button which is large, easy to find, and easy to push. He explains that tolerance for error overlaps with the universal design concept of redundancy. If there are fewer ways to be wrong or make mistakes, then there also become many ways to be right. So then applying this to the classroom, he says that if the goal is to understand and show how well you understand a difficult concept in class, there should be multiple avenues to get to that understanding and to convey it. So he says that in his own classroom, where there's often a reliance on discussion, he creates tolerance for error by making sure that students who don't want to raise their hands and respond in the moment can have time to write questions and comments down on note cards and submit them to be read aloud anonymously, removing some of the difficulty of trying out a new idea on the spot in an intense social situation. He explains that instead of using discussion as an informal and camouflaged form of testing, what he ends up getting is more and better input from students, which is what he wants to begin with. And so this way of getting responses from the class breaks down the idea that the only thinking students can do is in the few moments in which the teacher waits for them to respond, or even in the 50 to 80 minutes of a class session. He explains that students can do more and better thinking if given more time and different ways to contribute. So in addition to tolerance for error, the strategy also creates equitable use by recognizing diverse abilities, and it also ensures that the raise your hand modality isn't privileged over the note card technique, recognizing that raising hands isn't the best way to allow all students to show what they know and to shape what we can all know together. Also, it includes the universal design principle of lower physical effort, in that there's more space created for quiet, more time for students to process and compose their thoughts, and less emphasis on exchanges that can be anxiety-producing for some students. So this section really spoke to me because I personally really need time to formulate my thoughts. I really admire the way that some of my friends can just sort of start talking off the cuff and have it make sense, but I can't string my thoughts along as I go and still have it be comprehensible. It literally takes me 15 minutes to form a coherent thought, and it's not that I don't have good ideas or good insights and stuff, it's just that my brain needs time to process things so that I can organize my thoughts into a way that makes sense, you know? Everything makes sense in my head, but if I'm trying to communicate those thoughts verbally to other people, I really need time to organize things so that they then make sense and come across the way that I'm intending. And so what I'm trying to say here is that I really appreciate what Dolmage has proposed with giving people time to sit with ideas, because in classroom situations and meetings and stuff, I often end up not talking even when I do have things to say, because I feel like it just takes me a little longer than other people to make sure that my thought comes out right, or the way I'm intending it to. And so I especially like the note card method where people can choose to write things down, because I'm so visual and I need to see my thoughts written down in front of me in order to organize them properly. Truly, when I'm on Zoom calls, I have a sticky note from the sticky note app open on my computer, and if someone says something and I want to say something in response, I will literally start writing down my thoughts in point form and then organize it into a coherent sentence, because if I just try to start talking, it'll make sense in my head. I know what I'm trying to say, but the brain to mouth connection just doesn't work. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about myself. So in the next section, which is called On Futurity, Dolmage explains that the example he provided previously disrupts the relatively extreme bias of academia, which is the idea that learning has to happen in scheduled bursts and limited openings. And so it also disrupts the idea that knowledge is located in the teacher. He says that this idealization of the teacher, as well as the mechanization of learning, are legacies that universal design can seek to challenge. He says that the futurity of universal design creates space for different disability futures that we know are close to impossible to imagine in an ableist society, and particularly in one of its most ableist institutions, the university. He explains that the opposite of this disability futurity is curative time. And so curative time entails a curative imaginary, which is an understanding of disability that expects, assumes, and cannot imagine or comprehend anything other than disability being subject to interventions that are in service of compulsory able-bodiedness and able-mindedness. And so while curative time is the time of accommodation and seeking to erase disability, the potential of universal design is a future with more claiming of disability and a more positive experience of it, not the erasure of disability as some suggest. He explains that universal design seeks to increase access without negating the presence of disability, and really emphasizes that in order for universal design to be truly successful, it must be implemented without the erasure of embodied difference being a goal. Universal design has to work against things like the avoidance of the word disability by universities, and the way that in research disability is generally only mentioned as something researchers are fighting. And so unfortunately, these realities tend to crowd out the space needed to imagine a future in which disability is central and valued rather than eradicated. He closes the subsection by explaining that many of the benefits of universal design are bound to be unforeseen because the benefits of any design created for a broad range of users will be almost without exception unpredictable. And so he says that if we design things for one ideal body, things will constantly need to be retrofitted. If we design classroom activities for one mind, only a few students will be able to participate. But if we design a product with open-mindedness and inclusiveness, it can have an expanding range of uses. If we design a classroom activity for a broad range of minds, then all students will have a genuine opportunity to learn and to create new knowledge. In the subsection Bringing Disability, Usability, and Universal Design Together, Dolmage says that there can be no history of universal design without an understanding of usability. He begins by referencing Mara Mills, who writes about the history of hearing aids, and explains that much of the frustration that deaf and hard of hearing people felt was caused by the stigmatization of disability by society, not necessarily by the technologies. Mills exposes a key oversight in the history of design and technology. In the vast literature on users in technology over the past 30 years, people with disabilities have never been ascribed the competence of relevance to be centered in narratives of technological change, even though, as Dolmage explained in the previous chapter, disabled people and disability has played a huge role in technological developments. He says that universal design seeks to change this narrative moving forward and revise some of the narratives from the past, so we must then begin by revising the history of an interrelated concept, which is usability. He explains that he's particularly interested in the interaction between usability and universal design. Usability speaks for universal design and has played a crucial role in how it has been rhetorically constructed, and vice versa. So tracing the evolution of the term usability leads directly to its interaction with universal design, and the crossbreeding of the two concepts have led to the terms accessible design and inclusive design. He states that usability needs universal design, and universal design, specifically in educational contexts, needs usability. He explains that this connected relationship is necessary because without it, usability may become a way to talk about user-centered design while failing to recognize or center disability, and universal design becomes a way to talk about changing space to accommodate the broadest range of users while overlooking the importance of continued feedback from these users. In the next section, Histories, he goes a little more in depth about the genealogy of both usability and universal design, mentioning some of the commonalities and divergences in the historical development of the two concepts. So first he goes through usability, and he explains that usability has often been tied to the rights of people with disabilities. It foregrounds the ways bodies interact with technologies and environments, and often points out the ways environments and technologies exclude. He goes through the relationship between humans, disability, and technology in North America post-World War II, showing that disability came to be seen through new biological, cultural, and technological lenses, and redesign became a key component of usability theories and methods. However, it wasn't until the late 1980s to early 1990s that usability truly became part of the popular lexicon and part of institutional design in a real and revolutionary way, when usability principles were adopted into the telecommunications computer industry. Central to the development of usability was the push for more users to be involved in the design of products. So power was shifted to the user to illustrate the ways a technology best fit their needs, tasks, and expectations. Next, he looks at universal design, explaining that it doesn't have the same specific history. It kind of developed out of the usability movement. And so although early discourse about universal design borrowed heavily from the discourse of usability, he says that the key difference is that it's always been more closely tied to the goal of making the world more accessible specifically for people with disabilities than usability has. He states, "One of the philosophical bases of universal design is that disability is partially socially constructed. Genes alone don't disable people. An environment designed only for people with a certain body disables people whose bodies don't conform to this narrow norm. Changing this environment is a means of intervening in the social construction of disability. Interaction between person and world is not only made more efficient, it's made less oppressive. He shows that the passage of the ADA was instrumental in universal design gaining popularity because previous efforts to prioritize barrier-free design were now given legal reinforcement, and the rights of the disabled user were now inscribed in the law. He acknowledges that the ADA hasn't always led to the kind of revolutionary redesign of the environment that we might hope for, as he's articulated in previous chapters, but says that it has allowed universal design to come in the front door and has shown how user feedback, in the form of political protest, can create change. In this next section, he looks at critiques of usability in universal design, and he says that a critique of usability might focus on the failure to prioritize the value of different abilities, needs, and goals in users. Also, usability lacks a coherent theory of use or usefulness, and though usability foregrounds the importance of collaboration between users and producers, the ethical foundation of this relationship is underdeveloped. He emphasizes that as we design pedagogy, we must think about the use and usefulness of usability, and we must also consider it ethically. How are particular models and uses exclusive? How does usability in this way become a normative process? He explains that teachers have a responsibility to interrogate all spaces and all interfaces, as well as to share this responsibility equally with our students. He says that universal design offers a means of placing those with unconventional abilities, needs, and goals at the forefront of the design process, allowing for the addressing of power imbalances that lead to exclusive spaces, interfaces, and pedagogy. However, a critique of universal design would point out that there's no built-in process for collecting feedback from users, and thus no way to ensure that those who inhabit the design space have an active role in its reconstruction. Because of this, he argues that usability and universal design ask for one another, and says that particularly in the context of the classroom, together, usability and universal design offer a philosophical and practical basis for the kind of teaching that might be truly responsive to all students, and that might allow all students to be responsible for the direction of pedagogy. Dolmage explains that as students and teachers critique spaces and interfaces, Lessons from Disability Studies offers ways to prioritize and to value disability while developing the critical tools to intervene in the production of cultural space. Disability Studies scholarship has had a persistent and insistent voice in fields that claim to do the work of design of spaces or products or technologies. In this last bit of the subsection, he briefly investigates how disability studies reframes issues of normativity, accommodation, and inclusion in ways that must be considered by designers. So, disability studies theory holds that disability is partially socially constructed. It shows that disability as an invented category serves primarily to reify or reinforce a fictional norm, organizing classifications of difference around an unexamined, privileged, and normative center. Disability is posed, schematized, and discursively and materially regulated so that dominant positions can be maintained untroubled. The concept of design against normativity has even been developed as a response to this maintenance of the norm. A disability studies critique reveals something of the normativity of our teaching practices, reflected but also conditioned by the spaces and technologies we engage with. Dolmage explains that we need to consciously work against the values and habits and biases of mainstream design practices, internalizing the fact that just adding disability accomplishes nothing, and in fact strengthens the squeeze of the norm. The last subsection of the first half of the chapter is called Future for Disability, Usability, and Universal Design, where he kind of goes through his own personal take on usability and universal design. He explains by referencing Bow, who says that universal design for learning principles focus on multiple overlapping strategies, not the delivery of single streams of information, and not a blanket approach. And so even though people often use the terms universal design for learning and universal design of instruction interchangeably, Dolmage explains that he uses universal design for learning because the pedagogy is not solely about instruction, it's about the entire learning process. He then goes through his definition of universal design for learning, which is adapted from Bow and emphasizes expanding 3 vectors of the classroom dynamic. So the first focus is on how the teacher instructs, how we deliver information and engage students in the most accessible way possible. The second focus is on active learning by students, so varied forms of applied and interactive learning with course materials and a diverse community. And the third focus is on multiple options for student design, delivery, and expression, just having multiple ways for students to show what they know, share their ideas, compose for varying audiences, and then revise. He explains that these foci necessitate less teacher dictatorship and greater communal shaping. Universal design is a way of responding to changing space and developing technology, not with panic and reduction, but with planning for hybridity and transformation. He says that as a model, we should consider using the principles of usability in any classroom setting in which we strive for universal design for learning, and explains that when working with students, they collectively realized that although universal design for learning validated and valued their standpoints, there was nothing explicit in its principles that provided for anonymized student feedback as part of a dynamic and ongoing class-by-class process of pedagogy design and revision. He states that both he and his students wanted a more insistent principle of learner negotiation for universal design for learning, based on its principles of inclusion, and students said repeatedly that professors would know what works and what needs to be done if they just asked their own students. His students insisted that teachers had to allow students multiple modes of anonymous course assessment or critique to give them some control over course design so that their abilities and needs could be adequately addressed as the course went along, not just when it ended. He ends the subsection by stating that universal design is a matter of social justice, the importance of including everyone in the discussions that create space. But for universal design to be a transformative agenda, our work must be change-enhancing, interactive, contextualized, social, must allow individuals to rewrite institutions through rhetorical action, and must push us all to think broadly and generously. He explains that universal design does seem to include and embrace such possibilities and can be beneficially and continually rethought when combined with the user-centered and iterative push of usability. So that's all for the first half of chapter 4. I really enjoyed this chapter. I think this chapter is my favorite one in the whole book. I feel like just as someone who wants to be in education in some capacity in the future, this chapter is providing so many great pedagogical suggestions, things to think about, all of those sorts of things. And so yeah, I will get up the second half of chapter 4, hopefully tomorrow. And yeah, that's all. Bye! Filming these videos is a wild time because I've realized that I just have trouble speaking sometimes. If there's a lot of consonants, especially S's, if there's a lot of S's in a sentence, or there's a lot of R's or something, my tongue just I don't know, I just can't get the sentence out. And so there are so many clips of me needing to repeat a sentence 14 times because I just can't get it out. And it's not even you would think with the way I'm slurring some of my words, you would think that I'm intoxicated or something, and I'm not. I just can't talk.